In the first part of the 1700s, the Great Awakening brought new religious enthusiasms to the colonies. George Whitefield and John Wesley started a revival movement in England that became Methodism and was brought to these shores as well. In congregational churches, Timothy Dwight, Lyman Beecher, and Jonathan Edwards gave this awakening its fire. After the Revolutionary War, a second wave of revivalism blanketed the new United States. It featured revivals in small towns and large cities, and on the frontiers, something called camp meetings. During this time, many churches started shifting away from strict Calvinism with this emphasis on predestination and towards the idea that sinners could make a decision towards their own salvation. The meetings, these camp meetings and revivals, allow people to claim Christianity for themselves. And they were open events, open beyond sect or denomination. Today is the fourth in a 5-part series on the United Church of Christ, and we discovered the Congregationalists, part of New England's Pilgrim founding, the German Reformed tradition populated by an early 1700s immigration, the German Evangelical Church populated by an early 1800s immigration, and today we cover the last of these 4 major branches that came together to form the United Church of Christ, the Christian Connection. The Christian Connection arose from that spirit of the Second Awakening in different locations and with slightly different impulses that would eventually coalesce. In 1792, James O'Kelly, a Methodist preacher in Virginia and North Carolina, withdrew from the Methodist Church, along with some others, because he found church governance with its bishops and elders limited and infringed on the freedom of preachers. He wanted a more congregational polity. He led a schism which was called at first the Republican Methodists. Abner Jones, the son of Calvinistic Baptists in Vermont, read scripture and wondered that some doctrines could actually be correct. Finding nothing in scripture about Calvinism or Baptists, he decided that he wanted to be called nothing but a Christian. In 1801, he founded a congregation apart from any sect and simply called it the Christian Church. Jones preached throughout New England and along the way met Elias Smith, a pastor of a church in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who also had been raised as a Calvinistic Baptist and spent some time also in congregational churches, and similarly saw the need to restore some biblical simplicity. In fellowship with Jones, they decided that Jones would devote himself to preaching, while Elias Smith became the one who broadcast this movement. He started a publication in 1808, which is credited with being the first religious periodical ever, called the Herald of Gospel Liberty. In Kentucky, Barton Stone, a Presbyterian, found himself attracted to camp meetings, such as the 1801 Cane Ridge Revival. That's what's depicted on the front of your order of worship which attracted an estimated 20,000 people. When a colleague of his was censured for deviation from the Westminster Confession, a key doctrinal statement, Stone and 4 other of his colleagues left the presbytery to form their own, called the Springfield Presbytery. But eventually they dismantled that too, wanting to be known as Christians only, the name first given by divine authority to the disciples of Christ. And that's what our passage from Acts tells us today. Close by were Thomas and Alexander Campbell, Presbyterian Scotch-Irish immigrants, father and son, who rebelled against the dogmatic sectarianism of denominations. And they too became part of the conversations that shaped the Christian Connection. So now, what caused these geographically isolated movements of great similarity to pop up around the same time? Many people point to Jeffersonian republicanism with its revolutionary egalitarianism. In New England, there was little external constraint on congregational churches, but there was dissatisfaction with the way in which social controls were enacted with church discipline, and some dissatisfaction with the splintering of churches around theological issues, which seemed minor. In the South, the movement bristled against the hierarchical and class controls embedded in Presbyterian and Episcopal polity of the time. Now remember, polity is a fancy word for church governance structure. Episcopal polity uses bishops to govern. Think of the Episcopal Church and the Methodist Church. They both have episcopal polity. Presbyterian polity uses elders to govern. Think of Presbyterians, or our own German Reformed tradition had that polity. So this movement, the Christian Connection movement, thrived in rural settings in particular, where innovation was needed anyway for subsistence-type living, and the distinctions of class and education lost some meaning. The first generation of the Christian movement was populated by people who were mostly self-taught. However, in New England, innovation was spurred on by the congregational spirit of self-governance. Rejecting denominational structure, the Christian Connection relied instead on communication. Elias Smith's publication became the circulatory system of the Christian Connection as it published weekly stories about church plantings, religious intelligence, local revivals. And it was also through letters and articles in this magazine that debated and deliberated on various points that the Christian Connection hammered out its stand, its idea of how to be a church. Eventually, these 6 principles came to express the movement. Christ, the only head of the church. 2, the Bible, sufficient rule of faith and practice. 3, Christian character, the only measurement for membership. 4, the right of private judgment, interpretation of Scripture, and liberty of conscience. 5, the name Christian, worthy for Christ's followers. 6, unity of all Christ's followers in behalf of the world. Alas, human nature prevailed despite their emphasis on Christian unity. Debates on the practice of baptism and communion raged, and during the Civil War, the North and South split over slavery. Eventually, many of those in the Kentucky Barton Stone camp joined with the Campbells and became what is now the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, while some from the Stone camp joined with others in Virginia and in New England and partnered eventually with the Congregationalists, eventually in a 1931 merger. The Disciples of Christ, by the way, are the United Church of Christ's closest denominational partner, with a very transparent and smooth exchange of clergy and ministries. After the Civil War, groups of freed slaves established churches, and they joined this Christian movement. And in 1892, they came together in their own convention called the Afro-American Convention, which also eventually joined the Congregationalists. Like every branch that we've been talking about, this Christian branch too ended up valuing education, established Meadville Seminary in partnership with the Unitarians, and founded Defiance College, Antioch College, and Elon College in North Carolina. While the congregational side ordained the first woman in a local church in 1853, the Christian church was the first that as a structure, as a unified community, recognized women's authority and ordination in 1867. So what is our inheritance in the United Church of Christ from this branch of our founding? First, the full partnership of minority churches and of women's leadership. Black congregations were part of our community as independent churches, not as missionary expressions, because of the Christian connection. The Christian church also appreciated plucky resourcefulness and lively debate. Innovation is baked into this branch of the United Church of Christ. A legacy of journalism is part of what they brought to the United Church of Christ. And indeed, the United Church of Christ continues to have a portfolio of advocating for the public's right in broadcasting. It had a united and uniting spirit following those 6 principles that I read to you. A desire to cast away doctrine, including Calvinism, and that openness blended well with the openness of Congregationalists, wherein trust in a common Christ-centeredness and covenantal relationship were more essential than the specifics of belief. So, now we've covered all of the 4 main branches, and I keep saying the main branches because if you really dig into it, there's some curious little parts of little churches and organizations that also eventually would join to become the United Church of Christ. But these were the 4 main streams that came together. Next week, I'll be talking about that coming together and how it is that we live in covenant nowadays, what our governance structure looks like, and what is our theological heartbeat, the center of who we are. Blessings.